The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Springfield Public Library, casting long shadows across the quiet reading area. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell sat at his usual spot in the history section, surrounded by stacks of books about World War II tactics. His military short dark hair and perfect posture made him stand out among the casual readers, even in his simple civilian clothes, a plain blue t-shirt and well-worn jeans. James had been home for just 3 weeks after his third tour in Afghanistan. The library had become his favorite place to spend time, away from the loud, welcome home parties and the well-meaning but tiring questions from family and friends. Here, among the books, he found the piece he needed to focus on his research paper about modern military strategies. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly head librarian, walked past his table with a cart of books. She smiled warmly at him, just as she had done every day for the past 3 weeks. "Would you like some coffee, James?" she whispered, careful not to disturb the library's peaceful atmosphere. "I just made a fresh pot in the staff room." "Thank you, ma'am, but I'm good for now," James replied quietly, returning her smile. He had grown fond of Mrs. Thompson, who reminded him of his grandmother. She always made sure he was comfortable and sometimes brought him homemade cookies, saying he looked too thin after his deployment. The library was relatively empty that afternoon. A few college students sat at the computers, typing away at their assignments. An old man dozed in one of the comfortable armchairs near the magazine section, a newspaper spread across his lap. A young mother helped her 2 children pick out picture books in the children's section, their excited whispers carrying faintly across the room. James turned his attention back to his book, Modern Combat Tactics, from World War II to Present. His fingers traced the lines as he read, taking careful notes in his worn leather notebook. The familiar smell of old books and the soft sound of turning pages helped him concentrate. It was different from the constant alertness required in Afghanistan, where every sound could mean danger. His mind wandered briefly to his last tour. The hot, dusty air, the weight of his gear, the responsibility of leading his squad through dangerous territories. Here in the library, those memories felt distant, like scenes from a movie he had watched long ago. The peaceful environment helped him transition back to civilian life, one quiet afternoon at a time. A teenage girl at a nearby table dropped her textbook with a loud thud. James's hand twitched slightly. Old habits died hard, but he quickly relaxed. Mrs. Thompson looked over with concern, but he gave her a reassuring nod. She understood his situation better than most, having had a husband who served in Vietnam. The wall clock showed 2:30 p.m. James had been reading for nearly 3 hours straight. He stretched his shoulders and reached for his water bottle, maintaining the disciplined hydration schedule ingrained during his military service. The afternoon sunlight had shifted, now warming his back through the window. More students began filtering into the library as schools let out. James enjoyed their presence. Their quiet chatter and focused studying reminded him why he served. These young people could pursue their dreams in peace because of soldiers like him and his companions who chose to protect that peace. He turned another page in his book, pausing to examine a detailed diagram of battlefield formations. His own combat experience had taught him that while these traditional strategies remained important, modern warfare required additional skills, cultural awareness, quick decision-making, and the ability to de-escalate tense situations. The library's atmosphere grew slightly livelier as more people arrived, but it maintained its peaceful character. James checked his watch again. He planned to stay until closing time at 6 p.m., making the most of the quiet hours to work on his research. Little did he know that this ordinary afternoon was about to become anything but peaceful. Mrs. Thompson walked by again, this time carrying a stack of military history books. "I found these in the returns," she whispered. "Thought you might be interested." James thanked her with a nod, adding them to his growing collection. The sun continued its slow descent outside, casting golden light through the windows, while James remained absorbed in his studies, unaware of the confrontation that would soon disturb the library's tranquil atmosphere. The peaceful afternoon at Springfield Public Library shattered when the front doors burst open with a loud bang. 3 large men in leather vests strutted in, their heavy boots echoing through the quiet building. The biggest of them, a man with a thick gray beard and arms covered in tattoos, led the group. His vest displayed a patch reading Steel Wolves MC, Big Mike. The sudden noise made James Mitchell look up from his book. His trained eyes quickly assessed the situation. 3 men, all wearing the same motorcycle club colors, moving with aggressive body language. Behind him, he heard Mrs. Thompson's sharp intake of breath. "I'm telling you, those river rats are asking for trouble." Big Mike's voice boomed through the library, making several students jump in their seats. His 2 companions nodded eagerly. One was a younger man with a shaved head and a nose that looked like it had been broken several times. The other was shorter but muscular, with a wild red beard and sunburned arms. "Sir, please lower your voice," Mrs. Thompson called out from her desk, her voice trembling slightly. "This is a library." The 3 bikers turned to look at her, amused expressions on their faces. The red-bearded man laughed. "A library? No kidding, lady. We can see the books." More students began quietly packing their bags and leaving. The young mother James had noticed earlier hurriedly gathered her children, clutching them close as she headed for the side exit. The old man who had been sleeping in the armchair was now wide awake, watching the scene with worried eyes. "Those river rats think they can ride through our territory," the younger biker continued, his voice just as loud as his leader's. "We need to send them a message they won't forget." James remained in his seat, but his body tensed automatically. His military training kicked in as he monitored the situation. The bikers were positioning themselves near the front desk, effectively blocking the main exit. Their stance was confrontational, and their voices grew louder with each exchange. Mrs. Thompson stood up from her desk, trying to appear confident despite her obvious fear. "Gentlemen, I must insist that you either lower your voices or take your discussion outside. We have people trying to study here." Big Mike leaned over her desk, his massive frame towering over the elderly librarian. "Or what, Grandma? You gonna call the cops on us?" His breath smelled of cigarettes and coffee as he invaded her personal space. The few remaining patrons were now hiding behind bookshelves or trying to make themselves invisible behind their textbooks. A young library assistant had disappeared into the back room, likely calling the police. "Look at all these nerds hiding from us," the red-bearded man laughed, walking between the tables and deliberately knocking a stack of books to the floor. "What's the matter? Never seen real men before?" James watched as Mrs. Thompson's hands began to shake. She had been nothing but kind to him since his return from Afghanistan, offering him coffee and cookies, making sure he had everything he needed for his research. Seeing her frightened made something shift in his chest. The younger biker started pulling books off shelves randomly, tossing them on the floor. "Maybe we should make this our new clubhouse. What do you think, Mike? We could use a quiet place to plan our strategy against those river rats." Big Mike grinned, revealing a gold tooth. "Good idea, Tommy. And look, free coffee too." He reached over the desk toward Mrs. Thompson's personal coffee mug, making her step back in fear. James closed his book quietly and took a deep breath. He had hoped to avoid any confrontations during his leave, preferring to focus on his research and readjustment to civilian life. But as he watched these men terrorize innocent people in what had become his peaceful sanctuary, he knew he couldn't sit idle any longer. 3 years of leading combat missions in Afghanistan had taught him when a situation was about to explode. This was one of those moments. As Big Mike's fingers closed around Mrs. Thompson's coffee mug, James slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. James Mitchell rose from his chair with the fluid motion of a trained soldier. His movements were calm and deliberate as he adjusted his plain blue t-shirt and walked toward the front desk. Years of military training had taught him to approach volatile situations carefully, always looking for ways to de-escalate first. "That's enough," James said, his voice firm but controlled. He stopped about 10 feet from the bikers, maintaining a safe distance while positioning himself between them and Mrs. Thompson. "The lady asked you politely to leave." Big Mike turned slowly, coffee mug still in his massive hand. His eyes narrowed as he sized up James, taking in his military bearing and confident stance. The other 2 bikers moved to flank their leader, creating a half-circle around James. Well, Big Mike drawled, setting the coffee mug down with exaggerated care. "Looks like we got ourselves a hero." He stepped closer to James, using his height advantage to try and intimidate him. "This ain't your business, boy. Why don't you go back to your books?" James remained perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides. His mind quickly assessed the situation, just as he had done countless times in Afghanistan. The red-bearded biker was favoring his right side slightly, a potential weakness. The younger one, Tommy, kept shifting his weight nervously, suggesting he might be more bark than bite. "Actually, it is my business," James replied calmly. "This library has been good to me, and Mrs. Thompson deserves your respect. There's no need for trouble here." Tommy snickered, cracking his knuckles. "No need for trouble? Maybe you need new glasses, soldier boy. Trouble's already here." Mrs. Thompson watched anxiously from behind her desk. Her hand was on the phone, but she hadn't dialed yet, worried that calling the police might make things worse. Other patrons peeked out from behind bookshelves, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Look," James continued, his voice still measured and professional, "I understand you have issues with another group, but this isn't the place to handle it. There are children and elderly people here who just want to read in peace." Big Mike's face darkened. He stepped even closer, now just inches from James. His breath smelled of stale cigarettes as he spoke. "You understanding anything about us, boy? We're the Steel Wolves. We go where we want, do what we want." James didn't back down, but he also didn't make any aggressive moves. His combat experience had taught him that the next few seconds were crucial. He noticed Tommy's hand twitching toward his back pocket, possibly reaching for a weapon. "I understand more than you think," James replied. "I understand that real men don't intimidate elderly librarians. I understand that true strength isn't about making others afraid." The red-bearded biker laughed harshly. "Listen to this guy, Mike. Thinks he's some kind of philosopher." He moved closer, trying to get behind James, but the soldier supply adjusted his position to keep all three men in his line of sight. "Last chance," James said quietly. "Walk out that door, and we can all forget this happened. Nobody needs to get hurt today." Big Mike's face turned red with rage. The suggestion that he, the leader of the Steel Wolves, should back down in front of his men was too much to handle. "Nobody needs to get hurt?" he growled. "Only one getting hurt today is gonna be you, boy." Time seemed to slow down as James watched Big Mike's muscles tense. He saw the slight shift in the biker's weight that telegraphed his next move. Behind him, he heard Mrs. Thompson gasp. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor somewhere in the library seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. James took a slow, deep breath. He had tried reasoning. He had given them every chance to walk away. Now, as Big Mike's right hand clenched into a fist, James knew that peaceful options were no longer on the table. His body automatically shifted into a defensive stance, muscle memory from years of combat training taking over. Big Mike's fist came swinging in a wide arc toward James's face. To the watching library patrons, what happened next seemed almost like magic. James moved just slightly to the left, letting the big man's fist pass harmlessly through the air where his head had been a split second before. The momentum of the missed punch threw Big Mike off balance. Before he could recover, James stepped forward and used the biker's own weight against him, directing him smoothly into a nearby table. Big Mike crashed into it with a loud thud, sending books flying everywhere. "Mike!" Tommy shouted, pulling something from his back pocket. The fluorescent lights glinted off a small switchblade. Mrs. Thompson screamed from behind her desk, and several students ducked under their tables. James's combat training kicked in automatically. He moved with practiced efficiency, grabbing Tommy's wrist and applying pressure to a specific point. The younger biker's fingers opened involuntarily, and the knife clattered to the floor. In one fluid motion, James twisted Tommy's arm behind his back, using just enough force to control him without causing serious injury. "Stay down," James said firmly, his voice still calm despite the situation. He kicked the knife away, sending it sliding under a bookshelf. The red-bearded biker, seeing his friends handled so easily, hesitated for a moment. Then, with a roar of anger, he charged at James like a bull. James waited until the last possible second before stepping aside, letting the charging man's momentum carry him forward. He stuck out his foot at just the right moment, and the red-bearded biker tripped, stumbling into a cart full of books. Big Mike was getting back to his feet, his face red with rage and embarrassment. "You're dead, soldier boy," he growled, but there was a new note of uncertainty in his voice. He hadn't expected this kind of resistance. "No one needs to die today," James replied evenly, still holding Tommy in the control position. "This can still end peacefully." The red-bearded biker had untangled himself from the book cart and was now circling around, trying to get behind James. But James kept moving, maintaining his position so he could see all three men. His breathing remained steady, just as it had during combat situations in Afghanistan. "Let go of my boy," Big Mike demanded, his earlier confidence clearly shaken. Tommy struggled in James's grip but couldn't break free from the professional hold. "I'll let him go when you all agree to leave," James said. "No charges pressed, no police involved. Just walk out that door and don't come back." Mrs. Thompson had finally managed to dial 911 on the library phone. "Yes, please hurry," she whispered into the receiver. "But please don't use sirens. I'm worried it might make things worse." Big Mike looked around the library, taking in the scattered books, the frightened faces of the patrons, and his two ineffective companions. His gold tooth glinted as he clenched his jaw, clearly struggling with the decision. "This ain't over," he threatened, but his voice had lost its earlier power. "Nobody makes the Steel Wolves look bad." "This isn't about looking bad," James replied. "It's about doing what's right. Are we finished here?" The red-bearded biker looked to his leader for guidance. Big Mike stood there for a long moment, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod. James carefully released Tommy, maintaining his defensive stance as the young biker stumbled away from him. Tommy rubbed his wrist, looking at James with a mixture of fear and respect. "Remember," James said quietly, "this library is off limits now. Don't make me prove my point again." The three bikers began backing toward the door, trying to maintain what little dignity they had left. Big Mike pointed a thick finger at James. "Well, remember your face, soldier boy. This ain't the end." James stood perfectly still, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the bikers' angry confusion. He watched as they pushed through the library doors, their boots making angry thuds on the floor. As the library doors swung shut behind the bikers, a heavy silence filled the building. James could hear the roar of 3 motorcycles starting up outside, followed by the sound of them speeding away. He remained alert for a few more moments, making sure they were really gone. Mrs. Thompson was the first to move. Her hands were shaking as she came out from behind her desk, but her voice was filled with gratitude. "James, dear, I don't know how to thank you." She looked around at the scattered books and overturned furniture. "What a mess they've made." "It's okay, Mrs. Thompson," James said gently, already bending down to pick up the nearest books. "I'll help clean up." His military training had taught him that after any confrontation, it was important to restore order quickly. Students began emerging from their hiding spots behind bookshelves and under tables. Instead of leaving, many of them started helping to clean up. A young girl with glasses carefully straightened chairs while her friend collected fallen books. "That was amazing," a college student said as he helped James lift the heavy table back into position. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" James smiled modestly. "In the army. But fighting wasn't my first choice. Sometimes just showing confidence is enough to prevent violence." He arranged the chairs neatly around the table, his movements precise and organized. The young mother he had noticed earlier approached him, holding her children's hands. "Thank you," she said softly. "My kids, they were so scared, but you made us feel safe again." The older of her 2 children, a boy about 7 years old, looked up at James with wide eyes. "Are you a superhero?" he asked innocently. James knelt down to the boy's level. "No, just a soldier who believes in protecting people. Real heroes are the ones who help others every day, like your mom and Mrs. Thompson here." 2 police cars pulled up outside, their lights flashing but sirens silent as requested. Mrs. Thompson went to meet them at the door, explaining what had happened. James continued helping with the cleanup, preferring to stay busy rather than dwell on the incident. The library assistant who had hidden in the back room brought out coffee and cookies for everyone. "It's the least we can do," she said, offering the first cup to James. "You turned a scary situation into a chance for the community to come together." As people worked together to restore order, James noticed something interesting. The fear that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. Students who had never spoken to each other were working side by side, sharing stories and relief about what had happened. Mrs. Thompson returned from talking to the police. "They'll increase patrols around the library," she announced. "And they've taken down all the information about the Steel Wolves." She looked worried for a moment. "James, dear, do you think they'll really come back?" James straightened up from where he'd been collecting scattered papers. "They might think about it, but people like that usually move on to easier targets. They've learned this place is protected. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had dealt with similar situations before. The elderly man who had been sleeping earlier approached James with his newspaper tucked under his arm. "Son, I served in Vietnam," he said quietly. "What you did today, that was textbook military discipline. You protected people without causing unnecessary harm. Your commanding officer would be proud." James nodded respectfully to the veteran. "Thank you, sir. I just did what needed to be done." As the afternoon sun began to fade, the library slowly returned to normal. Books were back on their shelves, furniture was restored to its proper place, and people resumed their reading and studying. But something had changed. There was a new feeling of security, of community, that hadn't been there before. James finally returned to his own table, where his military history book still lay open. Mrs. Thompson brought him a fresh cup of coffee and placed it beside his book with a motherly smile. Later that evening, as the library was preparing to close, James heard police sirens in the distance. He looked up from his book, instantly alert, but Mrs. Thompson quickly reassured him. "Just the regular patrol they promised," she said, organizing the last few return books. The events of the afternoon had spread quickly through the small town of Springfield. Several people had recorded parts of the incident on their phones, though most had been too scared to capture the whole thing. The local news van was parked outside, hoping to get an interview with the hero soldier, as they were calling him. "I'd rather not talk to them," James told Mrs. Thompson when she mentioned the reporters. "What happened today isn't about getting attention." He continued helping her close up the library, making sure all the chairs were properly tucked under the tables. The library phone kept ringing with calls from curious townspeople and even a few veterans' organizations. The library assistant took most of the calls, politely telling people that they couldn't give out personal information about their patrons. As James packed up his books, the police officer who had taken statements earlier returned. Officer Sarah Rodriguez was a former Marine herself, and she understood James's desire to avoid publicity. "The Steel Wolves have a history of causing trouble," she explained, showing James and Mrs. Thompson some photos on her phone, "but they usually stick to the outskirts of town. This is the first time they've come this far into the city center." James listened carefully, his military training making him pay attention to every detail. "They mentioned another group, the River Rats?" he asked. Officer Rodriguez nodded. "They're rivals. There's been tension between them for months, but it's mostly just loud bikes and dirty looks. This was different. Coming into a library, threatening people, we're taking it very seriously." Mrs. Thompson brought them all coffee in paper cups, her hands now steady and sure. "What should we do if they come back?" she asked, worry creeping into her voice. "They won't," James said confidently. "Men like that are bullies. Once someone stands up to them, they usually back down. But just in case," he turned to Officer Rodriguez, "could you show Mrs. Thompson some basic security measures?" The officer smiled. "Already planned on it. We'll install better cameras tomorrow, and I'll have a patrol car drive by regularly during library hours." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the library windows in orange and gold. Most of the students had gone home, though a few stayed late, clearly feeling safer with James still there. The young mother from earlier had returned with her husband to thank James personally. "My wife told me what you did," the husband said, shaking James's hand firmly. "Not just fighting them off, the way you handled it. Thank you for protecting my family." James accepted their thanks modestly. Anyone would have done the same, he said, though everyone knew that wasn't true. Many would have hidden or run away, and few could have handled 3 angry bikers so effectively. Officer Rodriguez finished taking some additional notes and stood up. "I'll file my report tonight. And James?" She handed him her card. "If you ever consider a career in law enforcement after your service, give me a call. We need people like you." As closing time approached, Mrs. Thompson began turning off the reading lamps one by one. The library grew dimmer, but somehow it felt warmer and safer than ever before. James helped her check that all the windows were securely locked. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Mrs. Thompson asked as she gathered her belongings. "I know today was frightening, but—" "Of course," James replied without hesitation. "I still have research to do. And besides," he smiled, "this place feels like home now." They walked together to the parking lot, where the last rays of sunlight were fading. The news van had finally left, and the street was quiet except for the distant sound of a police car patrolling the area. James waited until Mrs. Thompson was safely in her car before walking to his own vehicle. Looking back at the library, its windows now dark against the twilight sky, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Today, he had protected more than just a building full of books. He had protected a sanctuary of learning, a place of peace, and most importantly, the people who made it special. The next morning, James arrived at the library earlier than usual. The morning sun was just beginning to warm the parking lot as he pulled in, noticing the new security cameras being installed by a maintenance crew. Officer Rodriguez stood nearby, supervising the installation. "Good morning," she called out to James. "Didn't expect to see you so early after yesterday's excitement." James smiled, carrying his usual stack of books. "Can't let yesterday change our routines." That's what they would want. His military training had taught him the importance of maintaining normalcy after difficult situations. Inside, Mrs. Thompson was already at her desk, arranging fresh flowers in a small vase. "Oh, James," she exclaimed happily. "I wasn't sure you'd come today. There's fresh coffee in the staff room, and," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "I made those oatmeal cookies you like." As James settled into his usual spot, he noticed some changes. The library had rearranged some furniture to create better sightlines to all corners. A new emergency button had been installed under Mrs. Thompson's desk, and a small security monitor showed feeds from the new cameras. Students began arriving for their morning study sessions. Instead of avoiding James or staring at him, they smiled and nodded respectfully. A few even came over to thank him again for yesterday. James accepted their thanks gracefully, but quickly returned to his books, not wanting to draw more attention to himself. Around mid-morning, the bell above the door chimed. James looked up automatically, his body tensing slightly. But it was only the elderly Vietnam veteran from yesterday, carrying a thick book under his arm. "Mind if I join you, son?" the veteran asked, gesturing to James's table. "Name's Frank Wilson. Thought we could talk about that research paper you're working on." James welcomed the company, and soon they were deep in conversation about military history and tactics. Frank shared stories from Vietnam, while James talked about how modern warfare had evolved. Their quiet discussion added to the peaceful atmosphere of the morning. Mrs. Thompson watched them from her desk, smiling at how the library was returning to normal, but with a stronger sense of community. The young mother from yesterday had returned with her children, now feeling completely safe. The kids waved excitedly at James before heading to the children's section. Around lunchtime, Officer Rodriguez returned with some news. "Thought you'd want to know," she said quietly to James and Mrs. Thompson. "The Steel Wolves had a meeting with their rivals, the River Rats, this morning. Apparently, word got out about what happened here. Both groups have agreed to keep their disputes away from public places." "That's good news," James replied, thinking about how often small actions could have bigger consequences than expected. His commanding officer in Afghanistan had always said that true strength wasn't about winning fights, but preventing them. The library assistant brought sandwiches for everyone, refusing to let James pay for his. "Your family now," she insisted. "We take care of our own here." As the afternoon progressed, James noticed more changes. Students who used to study alone were now sitting in small groups, looking out for each other. The library had ordered a new security guide, and Mrs. Thompson was organizing a safety awareness workshop for the staff. Frank shared his own observations. "You know what's really changed?" he said, looking around the room. "People aren't afraid anymore. They know this place is watched over." James understood what he meant. The library had always been a sanctuary, but now it was stronger. Not because of his actions alone, but because everyone had come together in response to the incident. A young student approached their table hesitantly. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "I'm writing an article for the school paper about community heroes. Would you?" "I appreciate the thought," James replied kindly, "but the real story isn't about me. It's about how this community protects its own. Why don't you interview Mrs. Thompson about the library's history, or Officer Rodriguez about community policing? Those are stories worth telling." The student's face lit up with understanding. She hurried off to talk to Mrs. Thompson, already pulling out her notebook. 1 month had passed since the incident with the Steel Wolves. The Springfield Public Library had changed in subtle but important ways. New security cameras watched over the parking lot, and Officer Rodriguez's patrol car drove by regularly. But the biggest changes were in the people themselves. James sat at his usual table, now shared with Frank Wilson, the Vietnam veteran who had become a regular study companion. They were discussing James's nearly finished research paper about modern military tactics and community peacekeeping. "You've included some interesting points about de-escalation," Frank said, reviewing the paper. "Your experience here at the library really influenced your conclusions, didn't it?" James nodded, looking around the busy room. The library was more crowded than ever these days. Parents felt safer bringing their children, and students preferred studying here to anywhere else in town. Even some former troublemakers had started coming in to read or use the computers, treated with the same respect as any other patron as long as they followed the rules. Mrs. Thompson approached their table with fresh coffee. She moved more confidently now, having completed a self-defense course that Officer Rodriguez had organized for the library staff. "James, dear," she said, "don't forget about the community safety meeting tomorrow. The children especially want to hear your talk." The monthly safety meetings had been James's idea, but the whole community had embraced them. He taught simple security awareness and basic self-defense, while Officer Rodriguez covered community policing topics. Even Frank contributed, sharing wisdom from his own military experience. "I haven't seen any motorcycles around here in weeks," the young library assistant commented as she shelved books nearby. "Not since that day." They found other places to meet, Officer Rodriguez said, joining the conversation during her regular check-in. "The steel wolves and river rats actually worked out their territory issues peacefully. Sometimes it just takes one incident to change people's perspectives." James smiled, remembering how different things had been a month ago. His research paper had evolved to include a section about how military peacekeeping principles could be applied to civilian life. The incident with the bikers had provided perfect real-world examples. The young mother whose children James had helped protect now ran a reading group for kids. She waved at him from the children's section, where her group was enjoying story time. Her son still thought James was a superhero, but now he understood that real heroes help their community in everyday ways. "Your paper's really good," Frank said, handing it back. "Especially the part about how strength isn't just about winning fights. It's about building something worth protecting." Mrs. Thompson returned with a small cake decorated with congratulations. "For finishing your paper," she explained. "And, well, we heard about your promotion." Staff Sergeant Mitchell. James looked surprised. He hadn't told anyone about the promotion yet. Mrs. Thompson smiled at his confusion. "Officer Rodriguez has friends in the military. Word gets around." The library had become more than just a quiet place to study. It was a symbol of community strength and unity. The new security measures were important, but the real security came from people looking out for each other. "I'll be deployed again next month," James announced quietly. "My unit's being sent to help train peacekeepers overseas." "We'll miss you," Mrs. Thompson said, tears in her eyes. "But you'll always have a home here." Frank patted James's shoulder. "You'll do good work over there, teaching others what you showed us here, how to protect what matters without losing our humanity." As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, James looked at his finished paper. The title page read, "Modern Military Tactics and Community Peacekeeping, a Study in Practical Applications." Below it, he had written a dedication to the Springfield Public Library community, who showed me that the strongest defenders are often the quietest ones. The library hummed with the peaceful sounds of people reading, studying, and sharing knowledge. James smiled, knowing that even when he was far away, this place would remain safe. Not because of what he had done, but because the community had learned to stand together. Mrs. Thompson rang the small bell that marked the end of another peaceful day at the library. As people packed up their books and laptops, there was a feeling of contentment in the air. The library had faced its challenge and emerged stronger, proving that sometimes the best victories are the ones that bring people together.